Welcome to our deep dive, and we're going to be looking at cybercommunism today.
Ooh, very interesting.
It's one of those things that kind of sounds like it's straight out of science fiction,
Yeah.
but there's actually a lot of serious thought that's gone into this, and a lot of people are talking about it. So we're
Yeah.
talking about using technology like AI,
Yeah.
the internet,
Yeah.
to create a society that basically operates on communist principles, so
Yeah.
classless, stateless,
Right.
um, and potentially with resources managed in a completely different way than we do now.
Yeah. It's funny because when you hear communism, you think very much
Right.
past.
Yeah, yeah.
But they're really taking this old ideology and trying to apply it
Right.
to future tech.
Exactly. And the sources we're looking at today really do paint a picture of a world that's almost unrecognizable to us right now. Like, imagine,
Yeah.
no money robots doing most of the work.
Yeah.
Decisions being made through direct democracy.
Yeah.
Maybe even with the help of AI. It's kind of a lot to wrap your head around, but
It is.
maybe we can start by unpacking one of the core principles of cybercommunism, and that's decentralization.
Yeah. So, instead of having the power in the hands of, a government or in the hands of a corporation,
Right.
power to the people.
Yeah.
Local communities kind of managing their own resources and making their own decisions. And, maybe even the internet itself is decentralized,
Okay.
so it's not.
So instead of having like Facebook or Google kind of controlling everything, it's more like a distributed network like Wikipedia,
Yeah,
where anybody can contribute.
exactly.
Nobody's really calling the shots.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting concept.
Yeah.
But could that really work, like, on a global scale?
Yeah.
How do you coordinate, millions and billions of people?
Right. And that's where this idea of this global scientific community
Yeah.
comes in. And, I got to say, it's a little bit of a head scratcher to me exactly how this would work. But the sources are saying that, you would have this community maybe aided by AI to set these overarching goals,
Uh,
but still allowing local autonomy.
Okay, so it's not pure anarchy. There's some
Okay.
kind of global governance. But
Mm-hmm.
you raised an interesting point there with the AI,
Yeah.
Like, what about the AI making the decision? I mean,
Mm.
isn't there a risk that we become too reliant on algorithms?
Yeah. Yeah.
That we kind of create a technocracy where it's these unelected experts,
Right.
or even the AI itself that holds all the power.
That's a valid concern, and I'm not sure that the sources really address that very well.
Yeah.
It makes you think, how would the scientific community be chosen in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, what are the checks and balances to make sure
Right.
that, things are transparent?
Exactly.
Couple,
Okay. So that's a good point. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about another pretty key component to cybercommunism, and that's the
Okay.
automation and resource management. And the sources paint a pretty radical picture here. We're talking about robots doing most of the work,
Right?
potentially leading to like an abundance of resources, like,
Yep.
maybe even scarcity as we know it
Uh-huh.
would be eliminated.
The idea is that AI and robotics will advance to a point where they can handle pretty much all the work that we do.
Wow.
And so, humans would be freed up to pursue whatever they want. They could contribute to society however they choose and really unlock a level of, creativity and innovation that we can only dream about right now.
That sounds pretty utopian.
It does.
But it does raise some questions, like what happens to work
Yeah.
as we know it?
Right.
Would people even be motivated to contribute if they didn't have to work to survive?
Uh-huh.
And how would resources even be distributed in a system like that?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Some of the thinkers are proposing this idea of collective ownership
Okay.
of resources, or maybe even a system where resources are just returned to a common pool
Yeah.
after use, which is,
Yeah.
very different from how we
Think
think about
about that.
things now.
Yeah. I mean, imagine, not owning your car or your house, but just having access to them as needed.
Right.
Would that be a more equitable society? Would that be more sustainable? Or
Yeah.
would it create new problems that we haven't even thought about yet? And would people even go for that?
It's a question worth considering, and it also ties into another key element of cybercommunism,
Okay.
which is the rating system.
Oh, yeah, the social rating system.
Yeah,
This is where it starts to feel a little bit dystopian to me,
I know, right?
kind of like Black Mirror-ish.
Yeah.
So, instead of money, we're talking about your access to resources and services being determined by, like, your contributions to society.
Right.
your professional skills.
Yeah, it's like this giant online reputation score
Right.
that, dictates your place
Yeah.
in this world.
It's a concept that definitely raises some eyebrows. I mean, the sources talk about it being transparent and objective based on, data and algorithms,
Mm-hmm.
that it would encourage people to, contribute to society and to do good.
Right.
But it's hard to not imagine that being manipulated or biased
Totally.
or even abused.
Absolutely.
Who decides what the criteria are for these ratings?
Right.
Can they be gamed? Can they be manipulated? And, what happens to the people that fall through the cracks?
Yeah, good questions.
It seems like it could go either way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, on the one hand, maybe it does create a more equitable society where everyone's rewarded for what they contribute, regardless of background or their social status.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, maybe it creates this world where we're constantly monitored and judged and, every action is scrutinized and quantified.
Right.
It's a slippery slope for sure.
It is.
And it's definitely something that we need to, think about carefully as we go deeper into this whole concept of cybercommunism.
Yeah. And as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I just want to pose this question to you, the listener.
Okay.
How do you feel about this social rating system? Does it intrigue you or does it, fill you with dread?
Right.
Hold on to that thought, and we're going to come back and talk about some more of these fascinating ideas.
All right. Sounds good.
In the world of cybercommunism.
Looking forward to it.
So, we were talking about this radical shift in society.
Yeah.
And you're probably thinking, well, how is that even possible?
Right.
And that's where these technological advancements that are so integral to cybercommunism come in. We're not just talking about the internet.
Right. It's more than that.
This is like a whole suite of emerging technologies that could reshape, every aspect of our lives.
Yeah. The sources mention things like blockchain, AI, VR, the Internet of Things, nanotechnology, robotics. Like, it's almost overwhelming.
It is.
To think about all these different technologies all converging to create this world.
It's really interesting how they're thinking about applying these in ways that we haven't even considered yet.
Yeah.
Like blockchain, we think about cryptocurrencies, but they're talking about using it for managing resources.
Oh, wow.
Even like voting in a direct democracy.
Well.
Or AI, not just for automating tasks.
Right.
But for like, complex decision making, maybe even managing entire economies.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about.
Yeah.
It's like a whole other level of technological integration. But the one that really kind of caught my eye and maybe even sent shivers down my spine a little bit is the neural interfaces.
Ooh, yeah.
Like, that's where it gets really...
That one's out there.
Yeah.
Imagine like a world where communication isn't limited by language.
Wow.
Or physical distance. You could share thoughts, ideas, even emotions directly with another person or even with an AI.
Right.
Through this brain-computer interface.
It's mind-boggling, but it also kind of raises some red flags for me.
Yeah.
Like, would this lead to greater understanding and empathy? Or could it be used for, like, manipulation and control?
Right.
And what would it even mean to be human?
Exactly.
If our thoughts aren't even our own anymore?
Big questions.
Yeah, big questions.
That we probably won't have the answers to for, decades.
Right.
But, let's step back from the sci-fi stuff for a minute and get back to this idea of human development being like, central to this cyber-communist society.
Yeah.
Like, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, I'm having trouble kind of picturing that.
Yeah.
Like, if work is mostly automated
Right.
and, our basic needs are being met, what's the motivation
Right.
to strive or to create or to contribute?
That's where this idea of like a fundamental shift in values comes in.
Okay.
So instead of being motivated by competition or material gain or even the need for survival, people would be encouraged to pursue their passions, to develop their skills, to contribute to the collective good.
Okay.
Just for like,
the satisfaction of it.
Yeah, the inherent satisfaction.
So it's like almost like flipping the script
right.
on how we view success now. Like instead of, how much money you make or what kind of car you drive.
Right.
It's about like personal growth.
Yeah.
And creativity.
Yeah.
And your contribution to the community.
Yeah. Could it work though?
I don't know. Could it?
On a large scale?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's where the idea of these communities
Yeah.
comes in.
Right. So people would naturally form these groups
Okay.
based on, shared interests or values or
Yeah.
goals.
Uh-huh.
And these communities would kind of become like the building blocks
Well,
of this cyber-communist society,
interesting.
providing a sense of belonging, purpose, mutual support.
So instead of like being forced into one giant system,
Right.
you could choose the community that aligns with your beliefs
Exactly.
and your aspirations, which I guess would address some of those concerns about like, conformity
Right.
and lack of individual expression that sometimes come up when you talk about
Yeah.
communism.
And then, within those communities, people would be free to pursue, whatever interests them, whether it's art or science or technology or
Yeah.
whatever.
So the idea is that once you remove the economic necessity,
Yeah.
then it just unlocks all this creativity and innovation.
Exactly.
That's pretty wild.
It is.
But how do you even begin to transition from, like, where we are now to something like that?
Well, that's the billion-dollar question.
Right.
And I'm not sure the sources really have a good answer for that.
Yeah.
They talk about kind of like a phased implementation,
Okay.
starting with the decentralization of resources and infrastructure,
Uh-huh.
then gradually transitioning to collective ownership and management, and eventually like dismantling those traditional power structures.
Sounds like a huge undertaking.
It does.
I mean, you would think there would be a lot of resistance
Yeah, for sure.
from the people that benefit from the current system.
Absolutely.
And even if you could get over those political and economic hurdles, like how do you change people's beliefs and behaviors that are so deeply ingrained?
Right. Yeah, it's hard to imagine everyone just like suddenly embracing this new way of life.
Exactly.
It would be a process.
Yeah.
It would take a lot of education, dialogue, experimentation.
Uh-huh.
The sources talk about using technology
Okay.
to help with that transition.
Interesting.
Like, platforms for communication and collaboration.
Right.
Maybe even like virtual simulations
Wow.
of what life would be like
That's pretty cool.
in this cyber-communist society.
But so it's not just about the technology itself.
Right.
It's about like building a whole social and cultural infrastructure
Exactly.
that could support such a radical shift.
Yeah. And that brings us to, another key aspect of this whole vision,
Okay.
which is, the role of direct democracy and
Yeah.
citizen engagement.
Okay, so we've talked about the decentralization, the automation, even the AI and decision making, but like, how would people actually participate
All right.
in shaping their own lives
Yeah.
and communities in this world?
Yeah.
And so we were talking about direct democracy and how that would function with so many people in all these different communities.
Well, they talk about using kind of a multi-layered approach to decision making.
Okay.
So it's like direct democracy, but with all these high-tech tools that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Like, imagine voting on local issues directly
Yeah.
using a blockchain platform.
Okay.
So it's transparent, it's tamper-proof.
Right.
And then, at a regional level or even a global level, you could have AI that's analyzing all that data,
Right.
identifying patterns and trends,
Right.
maybe even proposing solutions based on, what people want.
So instead of like electing representatives, we're talking about direct voting and AI
Yeah.
helping us make decisions.
To make those decisions.
It's pretty different from how we do things now,
Very different.
but I can kind of see how it could be more responsive,
Yeah.
more of a representative.
Uh-huh.
But what about that AI,
Right.
becoming too powerful?
Yeah, that's the big question.
How do we make sure it's a tool and not like a dictator?
Well, they talk about developing like ethical AI.
Ethical AI.
Algorithms that are designed to align with human values
Right.
and, to promote the common good.
Okay.
Some even suggest that the AI's decision-making processes should be completely transparent, like open for anyone to look at,
Wow.
to understand and maybe even modify the algorithms.
That's pretty radical.
It is.
So it sounds like they're trying to balance like,
Yeah.
the technology with human agency. It's not machines ruling the world, it's machines helping us.
Right.
But even if we could create a system that was truly democratic
Yeah.
and equitable, and we could overcome all the technical hurdles,
Mm-hmm.
like, would people actually want this?
That's a good question.
Would they be willing to give up their way of life?
Yeah, with all the, familiar comforts and freedoms
Right.
for this unknown future.
Yeah, that's the ultimate question.
Yeah.
I guess only time will tell. But
Yeah.
it's interesting, though.
It
It
is.
makes you think about what's possible,
Yeah.
what could be.
Even if this specific vision never happens,
Right.
it still gets us thinking
Yeah.
about how we organize society, how
Right.
we use technology.
To make a better future.
Exactly.
Yeah, it really makes you question everything,
It does.
from work to community.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the basic principles of cybercommunism
Yeah.
to all this amazing technology. But I think it's pretty clear we have more questions than answers.
We definitely do.
And that's what makes it so interesting.
It does.
This isn't a simple solution.
Right.
It's more like a thought experiment
Yeah.
that makes us think about the future
Mm-hmm.
that we want to create.
Yeah. So before we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay?
just one last thought for you, the listener.
Right.
If cybercommunism did become a reality,
Uh-huh.
what role would you want to play?
Yeah.
What would you contribute?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of community would you be part of?
Good questions.
Something to think about
Yeah,
as we move into this digital age.
absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into cybercommunism.
Thanks for listening, everyone.